Welcome everybody to our latest installment of Design at Large. Thank you all for coming. Before we get started here, I want to remind you that we have a Design at Large next week. However, it is on Friday at 4 p.m. Due to some travel constraints. So please come Friday at 4 p.m. This speaker will be Hiroshi Ishii. He is the inventor of tangible bits. And he'll be talking about things related to that. And like today's speaker, he's from MIT. So again, kind of an all MIT month here, maybe. So, but now I'd like to introduce Daniel Jackson, a long-term friend of mine from MIT in the CSAIL lab. He's one of the pioneers of what we call in computer science, and not all of your computer science. Lightweight formal methods, and it's just a major shift in the way we did mathematical types of work in the software engineering side of computing. Very influential. As part of that, Daniel is probably best known for his Alloy modeling language, which makes lightweight formal methods very easy to employ in verifying your software. So let me tell you a couple of things, one of which is in his bio, and one of which isn't. So the one that isn't is Daniel Jackson's father, is Michael Jackson. No, not that Michael Jackson. But a very famous early computer scientist who developed a methodology known as Jackson System Development, JSD. And if you look at it the right way, with a bit of perspective, you'll see the seeds of what you're going to hear about today, which I find to be really astonishing and very beautiful. But if you ever want to know something about the history of computing, you should read up on Michael Jackson. He's written many wonderful articles and books, and is quite a wonderful human being, and helped bring this wonderful human being here to us today. And lastly, Daniel is also a fine art photographer. Came to it a little bit later in life, but is a very excellent photographer, and he has an online show. Is it also? Do you have a physical show going on at MIT? What's it called? The Soul Strong.
It's published weekly in the MIT newspaper.
Okay. Do you do it every week, or is it?
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So if you look at this week's, I guess, this Soul Strong, it's very, very moving. So it's worth a look. And with that, I turn the stage over to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Bill. First of all, for the extremely generous and flattering introduction. I guess we're members of the club of sons of famous computer scientists. I'm also especially grateful to Bill for having made this connection, and I'm truly delighted to be here and talking to you. My secret mission is actually not so much to teach you anything, because I'm not sure I have anything to teach, but to learn useful things from you. So I've already had a bunch of really interesting discussions today, and I'm very curious to hear what your reactions will be to this stuff. Let me start then with some true confessions. The true confession is that when it comes to design, I'm really an outsider. As Bill said, I've been working in this area of formal methods for many years. And in the last couple of years, I actually published a revised edition of the book that I wrote about Alloy, which was rather ambitiously called Software Abstractions. And thinking back about this, I've always liked to think of myself as an iconoclast. My book was, and the whole Alloy approach was very countercultural at the time. But I'm increasingly coming to think that it's not only my book that needs a revised edition, but that Daniel Jackson also needs a revised edition. I've been coming to realize that the way that I think about software has been perhaps over-influenced by a view of software construction as being a scientific discipline. And I'm coming to think that it should be really viewed as a design discipline, with all the implications that has, that you're probably more aware of than me, that in the whole discussion of design as the third the third way of thinking. So this revised edition of me wants to be a designer, and this project I'm going to tell you about today is really my first step on the road to personal reformation. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, and I'm going to tell you about it. So it starts by asking the question, what is really software design all about? And here's my viewpoint. If you think about a traditional building, this is not a particularly traditional building, it's the one I work in, but if we think traditionally about the allocation of responsibilities in putting up such a building, we could divide the task between designers and engineers. And the designers and engineers construct using different elements and apply different goals to the selection of those elements. So an engineer is concerned with things like columns and beams and trusses, and those were all wonderfully visible in our building, before it was actually finished. But the designer is concerned with how the building will actually appear to the occupant. And so the designer is concerned with things like windows and walls and doors and so on, and the effects that they create for the user, as it were. The goals of the engineer, in short, are to make sure the building doesn't fall down, and also in the long term to make sure it's sustainable and durable and so on. The designer, though, sits at the interface between the building and the user, and is concerned with making, as Vitruvius put it, the building comfortable, convenient, and attractive. So how do we apply this to software? If we're looking at a software application, can we make the same kind of division? And I think we can. And engineers deal with things like functions and objects and modules and closures and callbacks and all those kinds of things. And their concerns are to make a system that's maintainable and correct, whatever that means, and hopefully fast. And these are all, to a large degree, although they can be rather subtle, objective measures that don't necessarily involve a lot of human involvement, although, of course, maintainability does to some degree. The designer, on the other hand, is interested in making a usable system. And I've learned from my colleagues in the HCI community that one useful way to think about usability is in terms of the triad of learnability, what some people call efficiency, but I prefer effectiveness, because efficiency seems to require some kind of quantitative measure, but normally we're just happy if we can get anything done with our tools. And then error tolerance, so that when users do the wrong thing, the nuclear warhead isn't prematurely released and so on. And the question I would ask is, what are the elements that a designer should think about in order to achieve these goals? And that's really what this project is about. Now, we can also think about criteria for making this assessment. And I would argue that in the context of engineering, we already know what those criteria are. In fact, I think there are two primary criteria, and they're both really due to David Parnas, which is kind of amazing. And they are, first of all, the idea of decoupling, namely that you want to be able to build the parts of your program so that when you change one, you don't have to change another. And secondly, the idea of localization, the idea that you want to take the key elements of the design and you want to localize them within individual parts of the program. And these have an interesting relationship. So they're a little hard to disentangle, but I believe they're two different things. But the question then is, what should the criteria be in this design domain? So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. Before I launch into this, a warning, this talk is full of details which might strike you as incredibly obsessive. My defense for that is, first of all, I think it's well established within the history of design to be obsessive. There's a delightful video of Joni Ive talking about the design work he does, and in particular how they shaped the casing of the MacBook and Mac laptop. And at the end of the video, in a moment of wonderful sort of self-reflection, he laughs and says, "That's pretty obsessive, isn't it?" And I love that moment, and other people have noticed this, because really design does require that you be obsessive about all kinds of little details. And I think that was one of the wonderful things in Don Norman's book, that the famous Norman door, right, might strike you as first as an obsessive concern. How easy is this door to operate? But then you realize that in that small detail, it's really a macrocosm of very significant concerns about what it means for us to be able to relate to objects. And of course, the famous comment by Charles Eames that details are not details, they are the design. So just to give you one little example of the flavor of a detail, which I think had very significant impact. If you look around the internet, you'll find all kinds of things where people describe the catastrophes that that they managed to recon themselves or other people with Dropbox. So here's one of them, a wonderful Quora question where someone asks the following. They say, someone accidentally deleted thousands of files in my company Dropbox. How can I quickly undelete them? And I love this question. This question, I think what I like most about this question is how obvious it is that this person is not a computer scientist. Because if they were a computer scientist, they would never have such absurd optimism. A, that undeletion should even be possible, but the nerve to think that it should happen quickly, right? If this question were written by a computer scientist, it would say something like, I'm obviously prepared to sacrifice all my children, to give up my lifelong income, and to wait 3 years. But please tell me, can I get the files back? But not this person. This is beautiful, isn't it? A hypothesis I have is that one of the reasons that people delete large numbers of files in Dropbox that belong to other people is because Dropbox has some simple conceptual flaws in it. And one of them is that the delete feature, the button that's labeled delete and the feature that is described as delete, actually has two completely different interpretations according to the context. If you delete a top-level share, it simply results in leaving that share. You're no longer sharing it with the person who originally offered it to you. If, however, you delete something within that share, you delete it not only from your copy, but because it's shared, you delete it from their copy too. So we did a little study of this, actually. It was a little undergraduate project. Kelly Zhang found about 50 or 60 MIT undergraduates, and she asked them to self-classify according to whether their knowledge of Dropbox was good, average, or poor. And then she simply asked them, she gave them little scenarios and said, what does deletion do in these two cases? And as you can see, they don't do very well. People with poor knowledge couldn't answer the question about deleting the top-level folder. None of them answered it correctly. But even the people with good knowledge, less than 60% of them could answer that question directly. And this is a very, very basic thing to understand about Dropbox. What happens when you press the delete button? So I claim that these details matter. So with that said, here are some more details. Here are three little software design problems that have intrigued me. The first one, email categories. So in Gmail, as you will know if you use Gmail, you can organize, your messages can be automatically classified according to criteria such as whether or not they're from social media or promotions and so on. And then you can organize your inbox with this nice tabbing structure. And you can customize what the tabs are and how they correspond to these categories. And you might think, well, this is a pretty delightful feature. This is very useful. However, when it came out, the blogosphere was not so happy with it. Here was one reaction, that it was super confusing. Here's another, really ugly, stupid, and unnecessary. Someone else said, Google gets it terribly, terribly wrong. And it quickly became apparent that this new feature is a disaster. So what is disastrous about this feature? Well, I believe that what's fundamentally wrong with this feature, and we'll talk more about this, is that this concept of category didn't seem to be necessary to anybody because there was already a concept of label. And nobody really understood why Google hadn't simply reused that concept. And in fact, when I was preparing these slides and curious to know how Google would explain the difference, I searched for a Google help page on labels, and it said this. Using labels. Labels help you organize your messages into categories. So this is slightly problematic. The key point here, though, and it's a point I want to make in all these three examples, is that it's not just that things are confusing, but that you really can't do stuff. This is important to tell computer scientists because usability, in the computer science world is a very hard battle to fight, right? For computer scientists, if there is a reachable path in the automaton, that's good enough, right? But the point is, in this automaton, there is not a reachable path. And in particular, you cannot associate tabs with labels. That feature is only available for categories. And you can't use tabs outside the inbox. So it's a very restricted piece of functionality. Here's my second example. So I have this lovely camera, which is a very popular camera that Fuji made. It's a sort of attempt at a Leica killer. And like all modern cameras, I can set the image quality, which in this case means deciding what kind of JPEG, if at all, I want to pair with the raw image. So I might choose, for example, fine plus raw. I'm looking through the viewfinder at my lovely daughter Rebecca. One of the things that this camera will do that is really cool is it allows you to change the aspect ratio. So I can pretend, essentially, every phone does this now, but it's a rarer feature in cameras. So I can pretend that my camera is like an Instagram machine. And this turns out to actually change the way you think about your photos if you can actually see them cropped like this. So I can do that by going to this menu here, whose name we'll come back to, and I can change it from 3 by 2, you see here, to 1 by 1, like that. And that will set up the feature like that. And now I'm in this nice situation where I have the quality I want and the aspect ratio I want. Now the question is, what do you think will happen if I decide I don't actually want to store a JPEG there? So I want to just switch it to RAW. Well, if I go and do that, this is what happens. It dutifully changes this to RAW, but this changes to RAW, really thumbing its nose at me and graying it out, as if to say, forget that, right? You can't change your aspect ratio anymore. So again, there's something you can't do. You can't have a non-standard aspect ratio and just a raw image. But you might say, well, that's obvious, isn't it? The cropping is just a post-processing step. It turns out it isn't. The underlying engine does a really nice thing here, which is that if you look at an image, it's perhaps a little hard for you to see, but here's an image with a square crop. I've opened this in Lightroom or Photoshop, and this is a raw image, and you can see that the crop is actually visible here, and it's a non-destructive crop, so I can take the crop off. So the camera is prepared to do exactly the right thing, but it makes you store a JPEG with it in order to do this. Here's my third example from the world of typography, which I've always been interested in. This is from Adobe InDesign. Let's suppose I want to define a character style to emphasize text, okay? So we've all seen styles like this. I give the style name emphasis, and I choose the font style italic. And then crucially, I don't specify the font family, because I want to be able to italicize any text. And this should work, right? So the question is, when I click on this submenu here, currently showing italic, what other options do you think it will offer me?
Bold. Yeah.
So you might think it's going to offer me bold, underline, and so on, if only that were the case. Here's what it offers you. And the problem here is that I have a lot of nice fonts that I've accumulated over the years, and they have all these subtle variants. So what's going on here is that the italicization of different fonts, notice, has different names. A light font, its italic form is called light italic. A semi-bold italic is called semi-bold italic, not italic. So what I can't do is I can't actually italicize fonts uniformly, because Arno would have to be called Arno italic, Futura would have to be called Futura oblique, Magma Light would have to be called Magma Light italic, right? So this basically doesn't work. So what kinds of problems are these? Well, are they minor nitpicks? I would say they're not. A, because they actually prevent you from doing real things, and B, when you have enough of these things in a system, they make it much less pleasant to use. Are they bugs? I would say no. My guess is that nobody reported these as a bug, and no one in these companies thinks they're bugs. The code clearly meets a coherent specification. Are they user interface flaws? Well, I would say in the narrow sense of what it means to do user interface analysis, they're not, because the interfaces are clear and faithful to the underlying function. Somehow the problem here is the underlying function. So the question is, can we address these usability concerns by sort of going below the syntax of the interface and understanding what these underlying things are? So getting to the essence of an app. So what characterizes an app? If you had to explain to a Martian who just landed on Earth, what Twitter is, what would you say? Or what Microsoft Word or any of these things is. So I contend that what I at least would do is I would try and explain the concepts that underlie these particular applications. So if I was going to explain a mail client, I would probably explain what an email address is and what a message is, and if I wanted to get really fancy, what a folder or a label is, and so on. If I want to explain Twitter, for example, I'd have to tell them what a tweet is and what hashtags and following are for, and so on. Now, in some cases, these concepts are really hard to explain. I don't think you can understand Photoshop, for example, if you don't understand layer masks. And I think it's a fault, a flaw of many tutorials for programs like Photoshop, that they're so eager to get you up to speed to show you how you can do, red eye removal, that they don't tell you the bad news, which is that basically until you understand what a layer mask is, you're never really going to be able to use Photoshop. So these concepts are really central. Furthermore, these concepts not only characterize individual applications, but they characterize classes of applications. So if we want to know, for example, what's the difference between a text editor, a word processor, and a desktop publishing app, I would argue it's the concepts. So text editors typically are about lines. Well, word processors are not about lines, right? Word processors are typically about paragraphs and have notions of format and style. Desktop publishing apps, on the other hand, not only have a notion of a style sheet, but they also typically have a notion of a text flow, that you can lay out boxes, indicate a linking pattern between them, and then when text is flowed into the first box in the sequence, it will flow into all the others. And this is how programs like InDesign allow you to do magazine layout and things like that. So here's a question that someone asked on a forum, which I think is very revealing. They said, I've just upgraded to the new Pages. This was Apple's infamous move from, I guess, what was iWork at 2009 to, I guess, version 5 or something. And I can't find a way to link text boxes anymore. Am I missing something? So this user is looking for what I'm calling here text flow, the ability to link text boxes together. And this user is in fact not missing something at all. Or rather, is missing something very serious. This concept has been removed because basically Apple has degraded Pages and has decided that Pages will no longer be a desktop publishing app, but will now be a word processor. That might be a very good decision for their consumer market, but it's a very sad decision for people who were using it for desktop publishing. You might ask, where do all these concepts come from? They all seem obvious to us once we've understood them, but we have to remember that they have a history. So words concepts, for example, come from this guy. They don't actually come from outer space. But this is a demonstration that if you're Charles Simonyi and you come up with really good concepts, then you become rich enough to take recreational Russian space flights. Now, the way that Charles Simonyi actually came up with the concept the concepts that are embodied in Word is actually something that now in design thinking is a very standard way to do things. He actually went out and talked to users. In this case, a company founded in the 19th century that did printing. And he asked them how they actually went from a manuscript to a printed document. And they taught him and his colleagues about the idea of style sheets. And he took that and embodied it in the Bravo text editor, and from there to Word, and from Word to Pages, and basically to every desktop word processor in the world. There are different kinds of concepts. Not all concepts are like these things that are invented. Some of them, or rather, that's exactly what I didn't want to say. They seem not to be invented. They seem to be out there in the world. The idea of a vote, the idea of a hotel or meal reservation. But of course, these were all invented at some point too by clever people. The idea of a social security number, which is a concept invented by the US government in 1936 as a very fundamental concept that had very profound, important consequences. So I see the invention of these things as design moves. There are what I call instrumental concepts, meaning that sometimes an application will use things, right, but they're not instrumental to the application. You can't really imagine Facebook working without the notion of a friend, for example. And then there are what I call enabling concepts, and these are the ones that are so fundamental you can't imagine them being replaced by anything else, or they are the things that make the application work. So in the case of a spreadsheet, for example, if you didn't have the notion of a relative reference, you wouldn't be able to copy a formula from one cell to another, and that would make a spreadsheet just completely unusable. So this very subtle concept turns out to be an enabler for spreadsheets. The key point is these are all invented. So that's what concepts are about. How do we actually explain a concept? So I'm going to present this in two parts. One is how do you sketch it, and then if you want to describe more detail, how do you do that? So here's an example of a designed artifact. These things are becoming rarer and rarer, but this is a timer. The question is, how would I explain to someone who'd never seen one of these things before how this works? Well, in my old formal methods days, I might have constructed a formal model of this thing, a state machine or something like that, and then tried to explain the state machine. But I've come to realize that really misses the forest for the tree, misses the, what's the expression? The forest for the trees for the forest? I never know which way it is. The point is that there's a very simple explanation that we can give of how this works that connects the actions of the user to their intended outcome. And that way is using a term invented by Michael Polanyi to use an operational principle. And an operational principle is an archetypal scenario that doesn't explain all the aspects of the behavior. It just picks the essential ones, ignoring the accidental ones. And it shows how the intended purpose is fulfilled by some combination of user and system actions. So for example, for our timer, what we might say is, if you pull out one of these little tabs, for example, the one marked, I can't even read this, 7 o'clock over there, right? Then when 7 o'clock comes around, the light will go on, right? That's the operational principle of this timer. And notice that this is very partial, right? It doesn't tell you everything about how it behaves. It doesn't tell you, for example, what happens if I pull out 12 o'clock at 12 o'clock. Who knows what will happen? Maybe you'll break the timer, right? The point is, that's not an operational principle of the timer. It might be part of the description of the behavior of the timer, but it's not the principle that motivates the design. This is the principle that motivates the design. And Polanyi used this as a way to explain the difference between science and engineering. He was very interested in patents and how patents are described. And he pointed out that the laws of physics, for example, could never explain how a clock works. To understand how a clock works, you need to understand its purpose and how the parts relate in fulfilling that purpose. So we can have operational principles for all kinds of things, for every concept we want to talk about. If we wanted to explain paragraph styles in Word, for example, the operational principle might be that if you change a style's format, then all paragraphs of that style will change format accordingly. So notice that's the crucial thing. It's not that you can attach a style to a new paragraph, even though you can do that, right? It's the fact that many paragraphs will have their formatting changed when you change the style. That's how the concept of a style fulfills the purpose of achieving uniform, consistent formatting. Sometimes the operational principle is pretty obscure. In the case of Facebook, if you tag a photo, all friends of the person tagged will be able to see the photo. This fulfills a purpose that's more Facebook's purpose than your purpose. Selection, I'll come back to this later. If you select some files and click delete, all those files will be deleted. Now, in addition to the operational principle connecting the concept to its purpose, there are misfits. So let me give you an example of that. Take the concept of the trash in the Macintosh, right? So it's an analogical concept, meaning that it appeals to us by virtue of it looking like a trash can that we have in our office. But of course its purpose is very different. The purpose of a real trash can is something like staging the removal of trash, so I don't have to go to the dumpster outside. This trash can has a very different purpose, which is to allow undo of deletions, right? And the operational principle is something like this. If you delete a file, it just gets moved to this special folder and you can restore it from there, okay? But emptying it removes the contents for good. But there are misfits. This concept actually is broken, or was broken for many, many years. Here are two examples. The first is that if you take a little external drive or a thumb drive, and you wonder if any of you have done this, and you plug it in and you try and move a file to it, the Finder will say, not enough space, delete some files. If you make the great mistake of not immediately opening the shell and using a Unix shell command to remove the files, if you delete them, right, you're still in the same situation because the trash hasn't been emptied, so there's no space on the drive. But now you have a dilemma, right, which is that if you now empty your trash, you will now make unrestorable all the files that you previously put in the trash from your main hard drive. So basically the problem is there's only one trash, even though you have multiple drives. Here's another misfit. You're deleting files late at night, right? But you really should be asleep in bed, but you're doing that kind of obsessive thing. I don't know if you ever do that. I do this kind of thing. And you're deleting files, and then suddenly you remember why you actually wanted that file that you deleted a minute ago. But you forgot the name of the file, right? Well, too late, right? If you follow the sensible approach of not deleting till you need to, you have 10,000 files in your trash. And you can't sort files by their deletion date. So if you don't remember the name of the file, there's no way to find it. Now, in fact, both of these have been fixed in recent versions of OS X, but only in the last year or two, which I think is kind of remarkable. Okay, how to model a concept. So if you want to say more than just sketching a concept, what can you do? So let's take the example of styles in Word. So here's how I think about doing it. The first thing is that I love data models, I have to say. So I draw a data model to represent the abstract state. So the data model in this case says that we've got a document that has a style sheet, has some paragraphs in it. Paragraph has exactly one style. A style has a collection of rules. A rule associates some value with a property, like 12 point with the property, font size, and so on. And then there's some complication here because a paragraph can also have explicit rules that override the style settings. The key idea, and then you can have other stuff, like styles can be based on each other, styles can have names, and so on. The key thing here, the thing that makes this concept work is, as David Wheeler put it, there's no problem in computer science that cannot be solved by introducing another level of indirection. And the extra level of indirection here is the notion of a style. So rather than going straight from paragraphs to rules, we go through styles. And that's what allows us to change the formatting of every header, for example, by going to the header style and then changing that rule so that all paragraphs of that style will be changed. And then we specify the operations, formally or informally, we list them and we say how they behave. So that's one aspect of modeling a concept more closely and precisely if you wanted to do that. The second thing you can do is you can arrange concepts in a dependence graph. And I define dependence in the following simple way. A concept C depends on a context C prime if basically whenever you have C, you must also have C prime. Every application that has C must also have C prime. So for example, you can't have style sheets without styles. That's obvious, right? Because style sheets are collections of styles. You can't have styles without something to style, like a paragraph. You can't have paragraphs without text. So this diagram sort of specifies a family of possible applications that you could build out of these concepts. And it's of course, the same idea as David Parnas's uses relation. The difference is that for him, those dependencies were the structure of a particular implementation. This is not a structure of a particular implementation. This says, however you do it, it will never make sense to have a word processor that has style sheets but no styles. So we can then sort of lay things out, different applications out in this structure. So something like Emacs, for example, just has text. Mac stickies have text and also allow you to format the text, but they don't have paragraphs. TextEdit is a very basic text editor that has both paragraphs and formatting. OpenOffice gives you styles, and Word gives you everything. So this is a way to basically think about concepts and how they're related. Now, of course, for any design discipline, most of the time you don't want to invent stuff, you want to steal it. So we can think about how to reuse concepts. And in fact, most of the best concepts are reused all over the place. So styles, for example, appear everywhere you look. So in PowerPoint, for example, there's a concept of color scheme, right, that allows you, for example, to assign particular colors to titles. And I don't remember what they're called because I don't use PowerPoint, but all those different things, top level points and so on. The background on the slide and so on. And that is, of course, a style mechanism because its purpose is to allow you to then decide that you want to change uniformly the formatting of every title in the document. Similarly, in InDesign has this nifty swatch menu to allow you to color things. And what's not immediately obvious is that if you, for example, pick on this cyan swatch and you color something cyan, if you go back to it and make this yellow, everything that you previously colored as cyan will now become yellow. So that this is really a style. On the other hand, there are non-instantiations, things that look like styles but aren't styles. Apple's color picker looks very similar to Adobe's swatches, but it isn't. Many text editors have things that look like you can style paragraphs, but you can't. In this case, the problem is here, these things aren't mutable. You can't change the color associated with the swatch. And so that wouldn't allow you to exploit that level of indirection. And in this case, there's actually no mapping between these styles and the underlying elements. They're not permanently associated with paragraphs, so you lose the benefit there. So we can build a data model for style as a generic concept. And I've been thinking about this in terms of a base and then different add-ons and variants that you can add. And then organizing these patterns in the style of the design patterns book, where you list the name of the style, its purpose, different ways it's used, and the operations, which other concepts it's related to. And then most interestingly, and I don't have time to discuss this, the particular design issues that come up with that concept. If you're going to implement it or use it, what do you need to know about how might go wrong? What might go wrong? Now, one of the things that has been very entertaining for me in thinking about concept idioms is how sometimes the most simple concepts, when you really try and document them, turn out to be quite intricate. So here's my favorite example because it's so blindingly obvious. I find it surprising how rich it is. And that's the concept I call selection. So for example, in Keynote, this app I'm using now, you can select thumbnails, and then if I click delete, all the selected slides will be deleted. In Lightroom, you can do the same thing with thumbnails of photos. Similarly, messages in Mail, notes in Evernote, thumbnails in Preview, and so on. Objects in the OS X Finder. But this notion of selection actually turns out to be extremely intricate and tricky. Let me just show you a few examples of that. The first is that many of these systems have a notion of selection scope. So in the Mac, for example, you can select things in multiple windows, right? But if I have these two windows open and I select multiple things, right, then notice that the selections have different colors, right? And this is to signify that if I now do a deletion, for example, it will actually only act on a subset, namely the ones that are in this case in the window that's highlighted. And these ones will be out of scope. There are also really interesting things actually that happen in the OS X Finder when you select both parents and children, but that's another matter. So this is an interesting and intricate aspect. Here's another one. The purpose of selection being to aggregate operations over some set. Some operations only apply to one element, right? So in Lightroom, for example, there's a command, go to next photo. Well, obviously I can't apply that to a set. So I'm not sure you can see here, but one item in the selection is slightly more brightly colored. And that's what they call the active selection. And you find this in a lot of places, that there's a key element. Here's another thing which I think is interesting. In Photoshop, you can select pixels by drawing these so-called marching ants. You drag your cursor around, and every pixel inside this border is now selected. However, it turns out that selection in Photoshop is actually rather a subtle matter because it's not binary. There's actually a continuous range, and if you go to quick mask mode, you can actually see that there's a kind of fading off towards the edge. This is called feathering in Photoshop. But the idea is basically that selection has become continuous. And finally, folder selection is a really interesting thing. What does it mean to select a folder? So in Google Drive, for example, selecting a folder means selecting the children. Right? They're equivalent. But in CrashPlan, selecting a folder means selecting all future children, which if you think about it is what you want, right? Because if you say I want you to back up this directory and later you put something in that directory, you don't want it not to be backed up because you hadn't selected it. So here what you have is a selection of folders playing a special role. So again, you can build models of these things, and I'm basically evolving a catalog of these common concepts. Okay, so far I've told you how to describe a concept and how to reuse old concepts. I'd now like to get to what I think is the more controversial part, which is if you've got a concept, how are you going to evaluate it? How are you going to know whether it's any good? And here is my fundamental principle, and I call it the fundamental principle because it is so outrageous and so ridiculous that if I didn't call it that, you would reject it immediately. Maybe you will anyway. And the fundamental principle is that in a well-designed system, each concept is motivated by one purpose. And what I mean by that is not at least one, I mean at most one as well. So it should look like this. If you have two purposes, you should have one concept for each purpose. And that means that these are the things that can go wrong. You can have a purpose that has no concept. You can have a concept that has no purpose, a useless concept. You can have two concepts trying to do the same thing. And this is the really controversial one. You can have a concept trying to do two different things. So let me give you some examples of this. So an unfulfilled purpose is where I have a purpose and no concept. And that means there's a sort of ghost concept you wish was there. So that's exactly what was going on in the InDesign example. You really wanted some concept that would group these fonts to allow you to do italicization. And that concept you might call a subfamily. And in fact, that's exactly what Keynote 09 has. And if you look here, you'll see the font is called Magma Light. And that is really a font subfamily. Unfortunately, Apple, for reasons I don't understand, in Keynote 6 reverted to the old model in which the font is now Magma and everything is now broken. There are many unfulfilled purposes. I think the one that we struggle with most in our lives is that we have no concept of user in email. You know, within the sort of bounds of Gmail, it's a bit better, but in the wild west outside there, right, there's no way of actually assigning users to email messages. And the result of that is not only that it's almost impossible to we can't authenticate ourselves, but it also means that just even if I want to find a message from a friend, that can be pretty tricky, particularly if they use different email addresses. Let me see. These are other fun examples. I'm going to skip them, but if you're interested in them, ask me afterwards. This eject after import is one I'm particularly interested in because it's a seemingly ridiculous feature that Adobe eliminated and then embarrassedly put back again when thousands of users complained about it. Unmotivated concepts are concepts that are there but don't have any purpose at all. These are harder to find. Poking on Facebook was perhaps an example of that. But I think there are lots of them. I think Git is actually a great resource for unmotivated concepts. In fact, I sometimes think that almost every concept in Git is unmotivated. But the notion of stashing in Git, for example, really doesn't make any sense at all. You could not explain to somebody what stashing is for. It's there just to make up for the fact that other stuff doesn't work. Similarly, boxing in Java. In 1977, Barbara Liskov had this nice language called Clue, which had objects in it, and integers were objects, and that sort of made sense. And you could do object-like things with them. And the designers of Java were I think, a little too keen to look like C++ and not shock people too much. And as a result, they had to introduce boxing, right? But boxing doesn't have a purpose. It's there just as a fudge. Similarly, you find other things. In JavaScript, there's a notion of null. And every time I have to teach JavaScript, I have to look it up and remind myself to explain to my students what null is. Because I never remember, because it has no purpose. There's no reason that you should have null when you already have undefined. Redundant concepts are when you have two concepts for the same thing. And that's what I claim is going on in Gmail, right? That the purpose is classifying messages, and labels already did that, so we didn't need categories. It's interesting, I did a little bit of study of Acrobat because I was trying to understand why a company like Adobe, which produces such fantastic programs as Lightroom and Photoshop, could produce something quite as bad as Acrobat. I struggled trying to understand what was wrong with Acrobat 9, which I could never use effectively. And then I noticed that in Acrobat 10, they did a kind of makeover, and they made it all really shiny and had these fancy, nice organizations of the features. But it turns out it was no easier to use. And the reason was that they still had multiple redundant concepts. So notice, for example, under this submenu, Edit Text and Objects, your options are to edit the document text, to edit an object, which in this case is text, or to add or edit a text box. So they have three things: document text, objects, and text boxes, which are all different and all play subtly different roles. And it's wickedly confusing which they are and which you should use. Finally, I used to make a lot of jokes at Adobe's expense in talks about what a mess this was. But actually they made life even better for me, because in Acrobat 11 they actually did a conceptual fix. And now if you look here, they only have text, and everything has been unified under a single concept. Now this finally is the controversial one, and I know you're all going to complain about this, so I have to start by appealing to a higher authority. So Matthew in the New Testament says the following: "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other." And I claim that that is what happens when you have a concept that's attempting to fulfill two purposes. You might think you can do it, but you will end up making people, at least some people, really unhappy. And I believe it happens for three reasons, and I call them piggybacking, false convergence, and emergent purposes. Piggybacking is that you have a new purpose that you hacked onto an old concept. It means that basically you didn't want to do the work, and we've all done this, right, in your implementation of really making something new. And I think this is what happened in my camera. That you see, the engineers said, let's put this cool aspect ratio feature in. And they said, well, where's it going to go? And they said, well, we've already got this menu for JPEGs that sizes the JPEGs and computes the pixel dimensions of the JPEG. Oh, dimensions, that sounds like aspect ratio, right? Let's put it in there. So there it goes. So now we have it as the second column. The first column was whether the JPEG was large, medium, or small. The third column was how many JPEGs you're going to get left on your card. So there goes the aspect ratio. Beautiful. But of course, now we have the problem. We've coupled the aspect ratio to the existence and sizing of the JPEG. So not surprisingly, when we take the JPEG away, everything breaks. Here's a much more horrifying example of piggybacking. So my Epson printer has piggybacked on top of the Apple printer driver in the following way. If you look at the paper size menu, right, and you click on it, here's what you see. US letter manual front, US letter manual roll, US letter sheet feeder, right? What's going on here is they've piggybacked onto the size of the page, the source, the paper source, right? The paper feed, where it comes from. And not surprisingly, this has catastrophic consequences. It means that if you set, for example, US letter manual front, it turns out, well, here are the problems. The first is that it turns out that you can only create custom sizes for certain of these paper sizes, and I don't really understand why. But in the case of my printer, you can't create custom margins, for example, for your own paper sizes. The other thing that's really weird, and not perhaps that surprising, is that other applications use page sizes. So Lightroom, for example, has a nice notion of page size presets. So if, for example, I want to print greetings cards, right? I design my greeting card and say I'm going to print it on a half-letter sheet. I'm going to put the photo on the top. I'll put a margin here. And I design that and save it as a preset. Now the problem is, I have to choose whether to save that as a preset, as a front-loading preset or a back-loading preset, right? And now if I decide I want to load my paper from the back, I can't use my preset anymore. So this is really horrible. False convergence is when two purposes, you thought they were the same, but they weren't really, or you thought they were aligned. So in my little foray into administrative work, I've come to the conclusion that this is such an example, that when we give our administrative staff performance reviews, we write, this is actually an excerpt from our form, we say we're really trying to do two things here. One of them is a very unfriendly thing, which is to evaluate your performance and decide how much money you're going to get. And the other is to provide very helpful feedback, right? And of course you can't do the two things in the very same form. It's rather like conference reviews, right? We like to imagine we can give the author really helpful, nice, friendly, constructive feedback, and we can also say your paper's crap and we won't accept it at the conference, right? But you can't, I don't believe you can do both those things. They are fundamentally in conflict with one another. Similarly, in Facebook, think about friending, right? Friending really has two different purposes. One is to filter incoming posts, so I don't see everybody's post in the world. And the other is to control access to my posts. And these are different purposes. And I believe it's for that reason that Facebook eventually added a notion of following, as Twitter has, in addition to the notion of friending. My last category is the notion of an emergent purpose, which means that you had a perfectly good purpose, but your users found other good purposes, but unfortunately those purposes didn't really work out. So here's an example of that. The subject field is a concept that we're all familiar with in email messages, and its initial purpose was very straightforward. It's to summarize the content of the message. Okay, but of course anything that can be so loosely used, people start doing other stuff with it. So one thing people started doing was revealing the sender of the message in the subject field. So listservs, for example, will often prefix the name of the listserv, this is our listserv in my lab, in the subject message. And you might think, well, this is pretty innocuous. But as Sriram Krishnamurti pointed out to me, he'd actually received a message that a colleague of his BCC'd to a bunch of people and hoped they wouldn't know that they were actually on a listserv, and he'd BCC'd the listserv. And of course the listserv went ahead and wrote the name of the listserv into the subject field. So the BCC was undermined by the fact that the listserv was abusing the subject field in that way. And finally, here's another example that we're all familiar with, which is that many email applications attempt to use subjects in order to create a notion of conversation. And that means that weird things happen. In particular in Gmail, if two things have the same subject, they will be in the same conversation and we'll end up with the same labels, even if they're completely different. So I'm rolling to a close now to tell you a little bit of sort of where this has been going. We've been doing a lot of these little examples, and I've had wonderful undergraduates who've pursued small case studies. We've also been doing a larger case study trying to understand Git. This is something my student Santiago has been doing for 2 years. We were particularly delighted when Randall Munroe explained Git in a much better way than we could. And here's what he said. So in short, the way you use Git is that you wait for something to go wrong and then you just delete everything and clone again. And the truth is, this is, I think, a pretty accurate description of what people do with Git. And we've been trying to understand whether one could make a version of Git that didn't suffer from this particular use case. So that's what Gitless is, and that's what Santiago's been working on. And to give you one example of a concept that we've reworked, Git has a concept of a branch whose purpose is to support an independent line of development. And the operational principle is basically when you switch branches, you start doing the work in the new branch, then you can switch back again, it gets merged in, and so on. The problem is there's a misfit, and the misfit is that if you have uncommitted changes, you can't switch branches. You can do something called stashing, but the problem is you can't do stashing if there are certain kinds of conflicts. So you're really in a terrible situation. So the way we solved this was by just changing the concept of branching, so that when you switch branches, you not only get something new in the repository, but you get an entirely new working directory as well. And your current working directory is simply put to the side. Essentially what you could achieve with stashing if you knew how to do it. And we ran a little user study of a bunch of Git experts that we brought into the lab, and we gave them a collection of tasks. We gave them a 15-minute lesson in Gitless, and then we videoed them trying to do these tasks. And we found that, not surprisingly, in some of them they were able to do it more quickly in Git. But we were pleased to see that in many cases, like this one for example, the variance of time taken was huge in Git and very small in Gitless. And we believe that's because in this case there are people who are really struggling very hard to get Git to do what they want. And then we asked them the normal kind of Likert questions, and they said the things we hoped they would say. So in conclusion, my proposal is that at least amongst the repertoire of elements that designers need to consider are these notions of concepts and purposes that are actually at the concept level, not purposes for the entire application, not needs in the large sense, but purposes that actually motivate the design of those individual concepts. And that one simple criterion that I believe goes further than you might imagine is to require that concepts be aligned one-to-one with purposes. And so one of the implications that has is that I think it can help think about some of our software development processes. Here's a slide that summarizes the history of software development in 3 pictures. We used to do things like this. This was waterfall, where our client had some requirements. We did some design and implementation and test, and then we had them do some tests. That was called the acceptance test. Then we switched to agile, which involved getting rid of requirements and design and doing some implementation ourselves. This is a little cheeky, but you get the point. Doing a little bit of implementation ourselves, then having our clients test it and so on. This is a caricature, of course. And now agile is no longer cool and design thinking is cool. And from my point of view, it seems we've put requirements back in again. We call it need finding, so nobody need be scared and think we're actually doing requirements, because we're doing need finding, which is much cooler. And design is back again, of course, because design is cool. And these things tend to sit between the client and the developer as a collaborative activity. But you might ask, for these newfangled processes, in the case of agile, how do you actually choose this increment? Right? How do you know, what they call this nice idea of the minimum viable product? What's it going to be? What's the first thing you're going to implement? And Bertram Meyer points out in his book, in a very nice book on agile development, what goes wrong if you choose these I's incorrectly. And for design thinking, I think an interesting question, which deserves more attention, is what goes in this design box. We have a lot of very nice activities like brainstorming and user studies and so on, but what kind of new intellectual methods can we bring to bear on that design step? And what I've been doing is really trying to think about one plausible way to answer those questions by thinking about an approach centered around concepts that are motivated by purposes, evaluated by criteria, and suggested by patterns, that can suggest these increments that you should do and can connect what we're doing not only to what the developers are actually going to build, but hopefully to the needs of the users. So in short, that's it, and I'd welcome questions.